Thank you.
Thank you, Leo, for those welcoming remarks. And I am honored and delighted to be here this afternoon to share with you some of my reflections about current research on the subject of Sun Yat-sen and the 1911 revolution. So history, of course, comes to life only in conversation with the present. The 1911 revolution was not only an important historical event. It's an interesting historical account for multiple reasons. First, different participants tell different stories about the revolution from day one. Second, in the past century, different Chinese political parties and overseas Chinese communities connect with that set of events in changing ways. And thirdly, the history of Chinese revolution is in some ways the history of Chinese modernity. What thinkers and scholars have to say on the subject about revolution reflect not only a reading of China's recent history, but also the meaning of its modernity. So with that as an opening, if we turn to the subject of Sun Yat-sen, we are assembled here to commemorate the opening of a major site in his revolutionary career. Sun Yat-sen was not an uncontroversial figure in his lifetime, and his memory was certainly not the subject of consensus after his death. So, first of all, about the question with regard to the contest over Sun Yat-sen's legacy. It happened well before 1949. Sun Yat-sen had served at the point of dispute in the civil conflict between the nationalists and the communists. Nationalist political legitimacy in the 1920s and 1930s rested upon Chiang Kai-shek's claim as the heir to Sun Yat-sen's political legacy. It also rested upon nationalist insistence on the persuasiveness of Sun Yat-sen's vision as outlined in the three principles of the people. In contrast, Chiang Kai-shek's left-wing detractors, namely Chairman Mao and others, had argued, ever since Chiang Kai-shek's 1927 purge of the communists from the Nationalist Party, that the nationalist regime had in fact betrayed Sun Yat-sen's vision and will. It's notable that there had been, between the founding of the Republic in 1911 and the death of its founder in the 1920s, at least two Sun Yat-sen. The first Sun Yat-sen was the leader or the agitator for the 1911 revolution and the provisional president of the Chinese Republic in 1912. The second Sun Yat-sen was the architect of the first united front, who had favored an alliance with the Comintern and a military campaign against the regime in Beijing. The dispute over Sun Yat-sen was a dispute over the domestic and the international agendas of the new republic in the Republican years. Now, as a result of that, one could say there is no Sun Yat-sen study or 1911 historical research that is not politicized in some way. And all commemorations of 1911 revolution as an event in the past have received the highest level of attention of political leadership from both the nationalist and the communist parties in China. These commemorations have also received an enormous amount of material support for their development. Now, as we know so well, the nationalist communist civil war of the 1940s concluded with the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 and the flight of the nationalists to Taiwan. In 1956, Mao Zedong celebrated from Beijing the 90th anniversary of the birthday of Sun Yat-sen. Mao's remarks set the tone for the 1961 celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Xinhai Geming that took place both in Wuhan and in Beijing. Mao was the architect of the thesis that China in the late 19th century was under the control of imperialism and feudalism, and it had degenerated into a semi-feudal, semi-colonial society. The 1911 revolution was a bourgeois revolution to emancipate the Chinese people from the oppressions of imperialists and feudal rulers. The 1911 revolution was also only the first in a series of social revolutions in modern China that were to culminate ultimately in the communist takeover in 1949. It was the task of the historians of the 1911 revolution to determine the social basis of this revolution, its class nature, and its limitations in light of the much more advanced new democracy and proletarian revolution of 1949 that Mao was to lead. Now that was the thesis established by Chairman Mao. This Maoist line of interpretation ended up being rejected on Taiwan and been revised in China, especially after 1979. So on Taiwan, which, as you recall, had been under the control of the Nationalist Party since 1949, party-sponsored readings of the 1911 revolution that glorified the Nationalist Party as the founding party of the 1911 revolution, that thesis did not go unchallenged. At the Academia Sinica, for instance, Taiwan's leading academic institution, scholars who examined the collapse of the Republic of China in 1949 ultimately arrived at the conclusion that late Qing gentry elite constitutional movement, modeled after the Meiji reform, deserved far greater recognition than it had received, and that the seeds of nationalist destruction in 1949 might have been planted as far back as 1911.